The story of 93-year-old rowing champion Richard Morgan. At 93, he's as fit as a 40-year-old. This is a case example that you don't have to take a bunch of supplements, or necessarily even any.
Could this be an example of someone who's reversed their age?
It's probably never too late to start. Everybody has an opportunity to improve their health, and that we know some of the ways that people can accomplish that.
Americans are sick for more of their lives.
The problem being this growing gap between health expectancy and life expectancy. My name is Matt Caberline, and welcome to the Optispan YouTube channel. Hey everyone, welcome to the Optispan podcast. We are going to try something new today. So this is something we call longevity this week. And the idea here is that periodically we'll pick, somewhere between 2 to 4 current stories in the field and do a little bit of a deeper dive on them and try to distill out, some of the key insights, or at least give our thoughts, takeaways on the stories. So today we picked 2 recent stories. One is about a 93-year-old world champion rower. So an example of what I would call extremely healthy aging, and what are some of the lessons we might be able to learn from that. And the second is article in the Wall Street Journal recently that was looking at the growing discrepancy between health expectancy and life expectancy. And so I'm joined again today by Nick Arapis, and Nick and I are going to talk through both of these articles. So hopefully you like this format, and if you do, I'd encourage you to, or even if you don't, I'd encourage you to leave some comments below so we can try to tweak it to make it as useful as possible. So so today we're going to start with the story of 93-year-old rowing champion Richard Morgan. This story actually first came across my radar from an article in the Washington Post. The title of that article was, "At 93, he's as fit as a 40-year-old. His body offers lessons on aging." And of course, given my sort of naturally skeptical mind, the first thing I thought was, come on, is he really as fit as a 40-year-old? So did a little bit of deeper digging and learned that the Washington Post article was actually based on a journal paper that was published previously in the Journal of Applied Physiology. And the title of that paper is "Physiological Characteristics of a 92-year-old four-time world champion rower." And one thing that I thought was interesting is the lead author on that article was actually Richard's grandson, which is kind of cool. And for anybody who's wondering, the reason why it was 92 years old in the scientific publication and 93 years old in the Washington Post was because he actually had his 93rd birthday in the intervening time between those two things. So anyways, Nick, I know you had a chance to take a look at both articles, and I'm interested to kind of get your takeaways.
Yeah, well, I'm impressed with his consistency to his workout routine, his discipline with his diet as well. It also, to me, may show that it's never too late to start an exercise and diet protocol or routine. Just some background for the audience is, like you said, he's 92 years old at the time of the study. He began rowing at 72 years old, and he was pretty sedentary up until then.
Right.
So he wasn't a lifelong athlete.
But worth noting, 20 years is still a pretty long time, right? So absolutely. He's had a significant training period to sort of get to the point that he's at now.
Yeah, you could say his training age is 20 years.
Right.
Yeah. So he's won multiple group age-related world records for rowing. And his body composition is striking for someone his age, including his body fat, which I believe was 15%.
Right. Yeah. So if I remember correctly, it was about 131 pounds and 5 feet 3 inches tall. So that gives him a BMI, right square in the middle of the normal range, about 22.6. And body fat, 15.4%. Probably just worth noting, the body fat assessment was not done by DEXA, which is the gold standard. It was done by electrical impedance, which, could be off plus or minus 10%, usually plus 10%. So, but even if it was 16.5, 17% body fat, still really impressive even for somebody in their 50s, but for somebody his age, very impressive.
Yeah, well, like you mentioned, the article said that he has a fitness of a 40-year-old. So is that true?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that's a hard thing to answer precisely, right? Again, we talked about body composition from that perspective. Yeah, I think you would say he's got a body composition that would be considered pretty good for somebody in their 40s or 50s. And if you take a little bit closer look at some of his physiological measurements, so maximum heart rate, vital capacity, things like that, again, all kind of in the range that we would consider good for somebody in their 40s or 50s. I think he one of the articles or an interview afterwards mentioned he had the highest maximum heart rate that had ever been recorded for somebody in his age. So again, I think it's fair to say that based on those kinds of measurements, he's got a fitness level that we would consider pretty good for somebody in their 40s or 50s. I think, it was kind of unfortunate that they did not do a DEXA scan. I would have been interested to know, like, what does his bone density look like? What do the positional muscle mass look like? That could maybe give a little bit more information. But yeah, I mean, I think it's, reasonable to say he's got pretty good fitness, better than a lot of 40 and 50-year-olds.
Yeah. So what was his training routine like?
Yeah. Again, I think you mentioned consistency. I think that plays an important role here. So it sounded like he didn't vary his routine very much, but he was very consistent. So he rode about 20 miles a week, a nice distribution of low intensity, I think about 70% low, 20% moderate, 10% high. Exercise for 40 minutes a day. I think one of the things that I took away and thought was probably an important component to his success was that in addition to the rowing and the cardio types of exercise, he was very consistent at doing resistance training 2 to 3 times a week, 3 sets of lunges, curls, and rows to failure. And so I think that combination, as we've talked about before, of cardiovascular training and weight training plays a really important role, especially as people are getting older, in terms of maintaining muscle function, bone density, things like that.
And what aspects of his diet stood out to you?
Yeah, again, I mean, I think he had a diet that most people would consider pretty high quality. So his grandson mentioned that he primarily eats whole foods. So again, very low in highly processed foods. Protein I thought was interesting. So he ate a diet that was relatively high in protein. So again, at a body weight of 130 pounds, if you just look at the RDA, recommended daily allowance for protein, that would be about 60 grams of protein a day. He ate about 110 grams of protein a day. I think his grandson said that he had a protein shake after his workouts. So again, pretty consistent with the idea that a relatively high protein diet in combination with regular exercise, including regular resistance training, is a path to success for many people and can play an important role in maintaining muscle mass and maintaining function as you get older. The other thing I thought was interesting, and especially given my somewhat skeptical stance on supplements, was his grandson said that he really doesn't take any supplements other than the protein shake. And so again, regardless of where you kind of stand on supplements, I think this is a case example that you don't have to take a bunch of supplements, or necessarily even any, to achieve what we would consider a pretty successful healthspan trajectory.
Okay. Yeah. So we hear a lot of people talk about how they can reverse age, reversing aging. And so if he was in his 70s when he started, now he's in his 90s, and the article says he has the fitness of a 40-year-old, could this be an example of someone who's reversed their age?
Yeah, again, I think we have to be really careful with the definitions that we use and the precision that we use in our language. I would say we know of many examples where you can reverse certain traits that go along with aging, or certain aspects of aging, right? And so it should come as no surprise to people that if you take a sedentary person, and I'm not talking about Richard's case necessarily, but if you take a sedentary, say 50-year-old person who's been eating a poor diet, very overweight, you get them to start eating a healthy diet, exercising regularly, doing resistance training, that you can improve things like muscle mass and VO2 max and fitness measurements. So we've known that for a long time. I would say that's not reversing aging, in the sense that you are not reversing biological aging as a whole. And I think in Richard's case, I mean, all you have to do is look at some of the pictures that were in both articles of Richard. He doesn't look like a 40-year-old, right? And so clearly, while he has improved physiological function in certain organs and tissues, maybe reversed some aspects of aging, he has not reversed aging in the sense that he went from looking like, acting like, being a 90-year-old in every way to being a 40-year-old in every way. And so I would say no, he has not reversed aging as a whole.
Okay. What do we know about exercise as an anti-aging strategy from laboratory studies?
Yeah, so I think the laboratory studies here are somewhat complicated to interpret. This is mostly going to come from work in rodents, so mice and rats. There are studies that have looked at the effects of exercise on health span metrics and lifespan in rodents. And in general, the consensus takeaway from those studies is that exercise can improve some health span metrics, doesn't really seem to significantly improve medium or maximum lifespan. Now, there are a couple of outlier studies where they reported an extension of lifespan. Those generally are cases where the controls were shorter lived than you would anticipate. So that's kind of hard to interpret. But again, I think the consensus would be that exercise in rodents can improve some aspects of health span, really doesn't seem to significantly increase lifespan. But again, I think it's really important to appreciate that those are hard studies to do, because really the only way that you can, effectively do lifelong exercise studies in rodents is to put a running wheel in the cage, right? So the comparison really is mice that don't have a running wheel versus mice that do have a running wheel. You're not controlling how much they exercise. It's all obviously voluntary exercise. You can't really model resistance training well in laboratory animals. There are people who've done some of this. That's really hard to do over a lifespan study. So I would say we don't really have a good comparison to what we might expect exercise impact to be on longevity in people. The other thing that's probably worth mentioning is, the biggest things that exercise impacts in people, I believe, in terms of health span, are going to be, muscle function, muscle mass, bone density, cardiovascular function. Those are not things that really limit lifespan in mice in general. So mice typically don't show a lot of sarcopenia. They certainly don't die from falls and fractures and things like that. And cardiovascular disease isn't really a longevity limiting factor in mice. Most mice in the laboratory are going to die from cancer, probably. And so it may also be a case where just the aging process and the things that exercise is most potent at impacting in people are just different in laboratory animals. So having said all of that, that's all my way of saying I think we have to be careful not to extrapolate too much from the laboratory studies. And I think if you look at the data in people, you can make an argument that exercise is probably the most effective longevity and health span promoting intervention in people, or certainly right up there with healthy diet. I mean, I think you could have a debate about, which could have the bigger impact. That's going to be dependent on the person, almost certainly. But I don't think there's any question that exercise positively impacts the biological aging process in people. I think the question is more around, which types of exercise are going to be most effective in different people or at different life stages, things like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So my last question is, what's sort of your big takeaway from this article?
Yeah, I mean, I think you sort of alluded to one of these things earlier, which is that it's probably never too late to start, right? So I think Richard's example, certainly is probably an outlier, and maybe he, is genetically predisposed to responding exceptionally well to exercise. But I think this is a nice example of somebody who really started taking control of his health in a meaningful way, it's in his early 70s, it sounds like, and has had pretty remarkable results. And I think that's probably true for most people. And the studies that have been done on lifestyle interventions or pro-longevity interventions like rapamycin in laboratory animals, I would say tend to back this up, where unless the pathology of an age-related disease has gotten to the point where modifying the biology of aging isn't going to modify that disease. So for example, if you have metastatic cancer, impacting the aging process might not have any impact on your disease progression. Unless a disease pathology has gotten to that point, it doesn't really seem like there's a time where it's too late to have a positive impact. That's true in mice with rapamycin. You can start very, very late in life and still get many of the benefits. And I think there's plenty of evidence in people that that's true as well. I'm not suggesting that everybody go out and start rowing 20 miles a week, but I think it's encouraging that everybody has an opportunity to improve their health, and that we know some of the ways that people can accomplish that.
Yeah, good advice. I think that was a great discussion for our first topic and leading into our next one. So it's from the Wall Street Journal, titled "Americans Are Sick for More of Their Lives" by Alex Jonin. So Matt, I know this is something that you've mentioned before, so I'm interested to hear what you thought of the article.
Yeah, so I think for the most part, the article got things right. That really talks about the growing discrepancy between health span and lifespan. It's an important topic. I would say, my one gut reaction when I first read the article was that if anything, it's pretty dramatically underestimating the scope of the problem. The problem being this growing gap between health expectancy and life expectancy. And I would say part of the reason why the article, again, in my opinion, underestimated the problem has to do with sloppy terminology around health span and what people mean when they use that word or how we go about measuring it. And so, I've talked about this before. For people who want a little bit more nuance on that topic, I'd refer viewers to our episode on defining health span and its role in living longer.
Okay, so this image on screen right now was in the article. Right. And could you help explain to me and the audience what IHME was trying to explain in this graph?
Yeah, so what this graphic is really showing is the gap between what they refer to as health adjusted life expectancy, or HALE, and life expectancy. So life expectancy is pretty obvious. That's just the length of life that the average person is expected to live. HALE is this little bit more complicated, in fact, a lot more complicated metric that is supposed to be a quantitative measure of health span. And what the graphic shows is that the gap between those two numbers, so how long we expect people to live and how long we expect people to live in a healthy state, has gone from about 10.8 years in 1990 to 12.7 years today. And again, as I mentioned, I think that's an underestimate, but I think it reflects the fact that there is this growing gap between health expectancy and life expectancy.
So you think the graph is underestimating the true scale of the problem? So what would you say to that?
Yeah, again, I think a little bit has to do with the use of this health adjusted life expectancy interchangeably with health span, and I think that's a mistake. And as I've said before, I would argue that health span really is a qualitative term. And what I mean by that is we don't have a consensus way to actually measure health span. And I think part of that is because health is not binary. It doesn't go from full health one day to no health the next day, at least for most people. It's really a continuous variable that changes over the life course. It can even go up and down as people go through different experiences. So HALE is really an effort to overcome this by creating a quantitative measure of health. And the way they do this is really complicated. I actually wasn't able to find a single formula that gave the exact calculation for HALE, but basically it's a combination of weighting different diseases and disabilities that different people may have based on a somewhat ambiguous severity estimation to get a single number of health. And so one of the problems is that, again, I don't really think that this HALE metric matches any reasonable or commonly accepted definition of health span, or really health, or what we would consider good health.
So why would they use something like HALE then?
Yeah, I think the obvious reason is they wanted to have something they could measure, and I agree with that. That's important. I think there are a couple of other factors here that may have complicated the way that HALE was developed. One could be that there is this expectation that older people are supposed to be in poor health compared to young people. And so this is sort of adjusted for instead of considering health on an absolute scale. In other words, what we would call poor health in a 30-year-old might be considered good health in a 60-year-old. And I actually think that's a mistake if you're trying to come up with a calculation that's supposed to reflect some quantitative metric of health. And the other thing that I think about, and I don't know for sure if this is true, but I do wonder if HALE is in some ways an effort to be a little bit politically correct. And what I mean by that is not define anyone who has a disability or a disease as having less than good health. And again, I get the rationale for that, but I don't know that that's helpful if we really want to accurately measure health trends.
Yeah, so it sounds like to me that we don't have a great way of quantifying health span. So do you have a suggestion what we could do?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of approaches here that I've thought about. One, I talked about in an article I published a few years ago, and the title of that article was "How Healthy is the Health Span Concept?" And in that case, I proposed that we develop a quantitative metric of health, which is kind of what HALE is. Again, I don't agree with the way HALE calculates health, but you could come up with something. But then track that quantitative metric over the life course, right? So what you really get, if you plotted that out, would be a curve where we've got this health metric on the y-axis and chronological age on the x-axis. And then you could look at something like the area under that curve as a single metric proxy for health span, right? So that's one approach. Another approach would be just to kind of reframe the discussion away from health span. Again, the problem with talking about health span is health doesn't go from 1 to 0, right? It's continuous. And we could talk about something like Sickspan, which would then define Sickspan as the period of life spent with at least one chronic disease or disability. And maybe we would say significant chronic disease or disability. So there's still a little bit of ambiguity there because we'd have to define what we mean by significant, but I'm confident that we could reach consensus in the field about, what would fall into significant disease or disability. And then Sickspan becomes very easy to calculate. It's just the period of life spent with one or more of these chronic diseases or disability. The nice thing about this definition is it is binary, so it's pretty easy to calculate, and there's not a lot of ambiguity about what we mean.
So if we use that definition of Sickspan, what does this gap look like?
Yeah, right. So this is where I think it gets interesting, and this is why I suggest that the 12 years in the Wall Street Journal article is a pretty massive underrepresentation. So, if we just look at a couple of statistics, right? One from the CDC, and this is a direct quote from their website, 60% of Americans live with at least one chronic disease, like heart disease and stroke, cancer, or diabetes. Okay, so by my definition of Sickspan, right, this would suggest that at least 60% of Americans are in that period of life where Sickspan has started. Okay. The other statistic here that's relevant is just the median age of the population in the United States. So according to the Census Bureau, the median age is 38.1 years. So that means 50% of Americans are under 38.1 years old. 50% of Americans are older than 38.1 years old. So if we just look at those two statistics, 60% have a chronic disease or disability. 50% are over 38.1 years. It's pretty clear that Sickspan, on average, starts at less than 38.1 years. So even if we use 38.1 years as the point at which, for the average American, Sickspan begins, that tells us that the difference between 38.1 and average life expectancy is a lot more than 12 years.
Yeah, and that kind of makes sense when you consider about 40% of Americans are obese.
Yeah, I think that statistic's true.
So that would suggest that the gap is probably closer to 40 years than the 12.7 that they recommended.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's exactly right. And again, we could have a discussion about, is that a good definition of how we would define somebody as not being in good health? I think absolutely nobody could argue with the statement that having a chronic disease or disability is less than optimal health. And I would argue that it's probably not what we would consider good health. So if we go with that definition, then yeah, it looks like the gap right now is around 4 decades.
Okay, so given the current trends, where do you see this going in the future?
Right. So that's the big question. And I think it's hard to know. So I would suggest that, where this gap goes in the future really depends on two things at the most basic sense. What happens to life expectancy and what happens to Sickspan. So if we look at life expectancy, I think it's kind of unclear. Over the last 3 or 4 decades, there's been a pretty dramatic increase in life expectancy in the United States and other developed countries around the world. That kind of stopped about 5 or 6 years ago and started to plateau. And then with COVID-19, there's actually a drop in life expectancy in the United States. And I think we don't know where it's going to go from here. Some people predict that life expectancy is going to start going up again. Some people predict it's going to kind of plateau. Other people predict it's going to go down. I really don't have a good guess as to what's going to happen. And I think this may be a case where, the United States may go on a different trajectory than a lot of the rest of the developed world. We have some systemic problems in our society around drug use and inequities in healthcare that could impact life expectancy going forward. So I think we'll just have to see. So the other piece here, though, is what's going to happen to Sickspan or healthspan, depending on how you want to think about it. And again, I don't know. I mean, I think there's positive and negative pressures here on population level trends in health. I do think there are some reasons to be optimistic. And so, I'd point to advances in cancer in particular. So both at the level of new screening methods, imaging, liquid biopsies, combined with immunotherapy for cancer. I think there's real reason for optimism that chronic sickness and mortality due to cancer is going to decrease in the coming years. Obesity, you mentioned. I think that's another place where there's some reason for optimism. After decades of seeing, very little hope when you look at the obesity trends, we now have these drugs, the GLP-1 agonists, that are pretty effective at helping people lose weight. And I think we're seeing new generations of anti-obesity drugs in the pipeline. So we don't know yet what the long-term efficacy or potential downsides to those drugs are, but right now it looks pretty promising. And so that could have a positive effect on not just obesity, but all of the other diseases of aging that go along with obesity. And then I think another reason why I'm somewhat optimistic is the science of aging, right? The discoveries that are coming out of the field of geroscience, that we are now understanding the biology of aging in a much more sophisticated way, starting to develop therapies that can actually target that biology, and can potentially have an outsized impact on health span and potentially life expectancy, but health span in particular. And I would say this is a fundamentally different approach than what has been done before, where typically biomedical research, pharmaceutical discovery has been focused on trying to treat individual diseases in isolation. If we can target the biology of aging, we can have an impact on all of the functional declines and diseases of aging simultaneously. And I talk more about this in the episode on understanding aging and disease. And then the fourth reason for optimism I would suggest is that I think we are finally starting to see a shift in mindset away from traditional reactive disease care towards more proactive, preventative healthcare. I'm not naive enough to think that, that's happening quickly or that it's going to be easy, but we're seeing more people talk about it. And I think that's the start. And clearly that's our mission at Optispan, is to hasten that transition as much as we can by enabling as many people as possible to become empowered to take control of their own health. And so in my view, that's really the most impactful way right now for us to start narrowing this gap and really start to push that health span curve out as far as possible.
All right. Well, thanks, Matt. I think that's a good note to end on for our first episode of Longevity This Week.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I enjoyed it. Hope everyone else did too. All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for this first edition of Longevity This Week. I hope you found it helpful and interesting. If you're enjoying this podcast series, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're also available on Spotify and on iTunes. The best place to leave comments and feedback is in the YouTube comment section, but you can also contact us directly by emailing us at optispanpodcast@gmail.com. We, of course, always welcome your suggestions on future episodes, guests you would like to see interviewed, or any questions you have.